How's it going?
Good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you.
Cool. So many of you guys know that Dan and I work together at Coinbase. I always said when we worked together that I thought Dan would be kind of one of the most successful people post Coinbase. And then when I learned that he was building a product that really resonated with me, and I started using it and loved it. It was kind of a no-brainer for us to invest. Dan, why don't we start? What was your biggest lesson from Coinbase that kind of has helped you navigate Farcaster and really, you base your building Farcaster on, if anything?
I think the thing that Coinbase did really well, and I learned there and continues to do well today, is a sense of pragmatism in a space that is or can be pretty ideological. And so, when we were working back at Coinbase in 2014, Nick, we were Bitcoin only. And I think there's kind of a very hardcore culture within Bitcoin of, not your keys, not your coins, and Coinbase is evil. And it's kind of disheartening if you spend too much time like reading Twitter or things like that, or talking to like hardcore crypto people, to have them be kind of saying what you're doing isn't real crypto, or is in kind of antithesis to the core values of the community. And then kind of over the 5 years I was there, we onboarded 100 plus million people into crypto, and the kind of primary on-ramp for most people getting into crypto for the first time. And then you kind of quickly realize that it's easy to be ideological and have opinions on Twitter. It's extremely difficult to build an at-scale financial services company that follows the regulatory regime, right? Like, you're not doing the stuff that FTX was doing, while at the same time still actually providing kind of fundamentally new technology and kind of innovation. And so I think something I deeply respect about Brian's ability to kind of like continue on the kind of like path towards this being this mission-driven company of like building in crypto and not getting distracted with things like blockchain, but at the same time realizing, hey, we need to follow the regulations. Like, this isn't kind of like Uber or Airbnb where, a local taxi regulator or kind of housing authority can kind of give you a slap in the wrist. Like, you get on the wrong side of Treasury or the DOJ, you go to jail. Mm-hmm. And I think that balance of kind of wanting to move forward while at the same time knowing what rules that are like kind of non-negotiable, and also just relative to the ideology in the space and just like the fundamental UX and pragmatism of like building an app that people can use. I think that is very much internalized for me as I've approached Farcaster.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like to call it the intersection of purist and tourist. I talked about it a little bit early, but the purists are the Bitcoin maxis or the kind of deep ideologues, and the tourists are, you could debate about who exactly they are, but maybe FTX, Solana, things like that. And I think really you kind of want to be at the intersection, right? And that's obviously what you're trying to do at Farcaster. So decentralized social has kind of become a big narrative in the last year or two, right? And there's a lot of new products popping up. Farcaster is one of them. I think the unique things about your approach is you've kept Farcaster gated for the past year, really, year plus, I think. And that's at a time when you have all these people that want to leave Twitter. You have more and more talk about decentralized social. So why take that approach of keeping it gated versus kind of trying to capitalize on the interest in decentralized social?
Yeah, so two ways to think about it. So the first is we started working on this in 2020 when I originally remember telling some of the people who were kind of interested in what I was working on next, hey, I'm going to work on building Twitter as a protocol. And people kind of looked at me being like, that's kind of complete waste of your time. Like, what are you thinking? This is pre-Trump getting kicked off Twitter. Like, it was just kind of like the only people who need an alternative to Twitter are kind of like this deplorable set of kind of political folks. And like, why are you even spending your time? You're just going to get a Parler or Gab. That's what you're going to do. Fast forward to, Trump getting kicked off, which again, I think most people on the left side of the political spectrum have been like, okay, that seems reasonable. To then Elon acquiring Twitter, and then quickly the same people going, wait a second, like we shouldn't have one individual controlling a social network like this. I think things have gotten, it's like trendy to say, oh, like, look, protocol-based social networks or decentralized social networks, it's their moment, right? Mastodon and all these other things. Our opinion, going back to the fact that we were predating this trend, is the best social network in history in terms of total daily active users is Facebook, still growing. They just, I think hit like 3 billion daily active users or something. They were gated for 2.5 years. You could not sign up on Facebook if you wanted without a .edu email address, which is some version of kind of quality gating for the first 2.5 years. And so if it worked for Facebook, why wouldn't it work for a new social network? And I think that there's this kind of meme that happened in the 2010s. I like to call it a zero interest rate phenomenon plus the S curve for mobile, is social networks grow virally and just kind of, you have this explosive growth overnight and it's kind of an overnight success. Whereas I think most important things and things that last just are a kind of like slow but consistent compounding. And so that was our original strategy. And so when things changed in the fall and people saying, hey, like this is the moment for decentralized social, why aren't you opening up the floodgates? The second framework that we kind of applied to that to say, okay, should we revisit this core tenet of our strategy of keeping things gated and just kind of consistent compounding and growth, is the framework of stated versus revealed preference, which has been pretty brutal in terms of building a product in this space. Of my initial set of people that I went after for Farcaster were all of my kind of like crypto friends who've been talking about the need for decentralized social and talking a big game on Twitter about how we needed this. And so we go and build the first version. I onboard them over Zoom. They are kind of excited about it, and then they use it for that day, and then they don't come back. And I think that's the stated preference on Twitter is that they care about this stuff. The reveal preference is they have 500,000 followers on Twitter, and they've spent 10 years building that audience. They're not going to go give that away tomorrow. So even if they kind of like want to talk about the merits of decentralization, using a new decentralized product, even if it's halfway decent, is not actually optimizing for the thing that the reveal preference is. What they care about is reach and audience. And so our thought is that this stated versus revealed preference, this is not going to change right now. Like, so if you're complaining about Twitter for whatever reason, and you're saying you're going to Mastodon, if you've seen the data, like, in the fall, people were saying, you're crazy, why aren't you opening it up? Mastodon, I think, had a 60% correction in their, by the way, they're calling monthly active users, which is not how Facebook measures their social network. Daily active users is the actual liquidity of a social network. And no one wants to share daily active users because daily active users is a really, really hard number to grow. But those numbers are down. And so the stated preference is Twitter sucks, I'm leaving Twitter. You announce that on Twitter, by the way, you don't say that on Mastodon. And then you go use Mastodon for a few weeks and then you come back to Twitter. And so I think we're back at the same place where there are no shortcuts to building something that's valuable. And I think in our view, I would rather focus on what I would call Farcaster natives, people who don't already have a lot of accrued social capital on Twitter and are actually willing to do the proof of work into a new social network where they're contributing to the conversational liquidity and things like that. And I think that's the foundation that we want to be able to grow from. And so far that strategy's worked out pretty well, right? It took us a really, really long time to hit what I would think of as like that kind of first order of magnitude of conversational liquidity, where you open up the app. So the app is like Twitter, and there would be new posts other than from me. And once we hit that point, what was interesting is the secondary effect of that is now people started to want to tinker with the permissionless APIs. And so that kind of back and forth is the thing that we're maniacally focused on, is continue to grow daily active users, retain daily active users that are using the product, which is going to encourage people to start building more apps. More apps bring in more users, and that's the kind of ping pong for this social network. And I think that the last thing is, Jim, there are not that many examples of people trying to build both a social network and a protocol at the same time. I actually think Mastodon is probably the only other example. And they've been working for 5 years and only had a little bit of growth recently based on this kind of Elon stuff. And even that, it was actually temporary. So my view is Rome's not built in a day, and anyone who's trying to think that's going to happen, they're not thinking in a long enough term mindset.
Yeah. And the way I think you're gating is also kind of unique. It's like you're not gating like Facebook did, where it's, just people at Harvard or just Ivy League schools to start or whatever. You're kind of curating the community really yourself, aren't you? I mean, you're still kind of talking to pretty much every user that comes on, and it's all kind of through you, I think. And to me, that has been a really good strategy, because the feed is really unique in Farcaster. It's very different than my Twitter feed, where it's all about the current thing, and whether if FTX is the current thing, everything on Twitter is FTX. In Farcaster, there's no FTX. It's kind of unique, kind of like you said, Farcaster natives that are talking about different things. Maybe talk a little bit about just how you've gated.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in Paul Graham's do things that don't scale. Like at each part of the startup, there's probably a new thing you can kind of fake it till you make it, and manually do something longer than you think. And so we're about 8,000 people in the beta. I onboarded the first 400 manually. So like a 15, 30-minute Zoom call like this, walking through, got a really good understanding of the new user experience. And so I think we've been able to polish that pretty well. And anecdotally, I think feedback is like, this is as good as any Web3 onboarding. But I think the next stage, I had to shift from, I can't do every individual onboarding. And so what I did is I shifted it to my Twitter DM inbox. We experimented with a couple different things, but this one worked because, one, you're a good candidate for Farcaster if you're already active on Twitter. Like the reveal preferences, if you're tweeting and using that network in a good way, you're probably most likely to convert in a good way for Farcaster, versus if you've never used Twitter, like jumping into Farcaster right away, probably low likelihood that you're going to retain. The second thing also, which is I think underrated, is I have a direct line of communication to every single one of the users on Farcaster in an app that even if they stop using Farcaster or gets uninstalled from their phone, I have high confidence they probably still have Twitter. And so the ability to DM basically any churned user and ask for feedback has been really helpful from a product standpoint. And one nice thing is there's some friction, right? You have to DM me to get it on Farcaster. I have to kind of take a quick look at your profile, say, sure, I invite you. But because of that kind of initial connection, I've had like a really, really high hit rate to be able to reach out to anyone. And then they're willing to give me, 2 messages worth of feedback. And so over the last 2 years, the aggregate amount of feedback from churned users, who usually, if you were to send them an email survey, they're never going to fill that out. It's kind of loaded in their inbox, versus a direct message from someone that they already had previously messaged with, is a bit of a hack just in terms of attention. Yeah. And so I think that that's really been informative for just how we've iterated on the product. And so we're getting to the end of this. Like we're about to launch kind of user-driven invites, but I think a lot of the lessons that I've learned, both in the kind of like how to make sure onboarding is really smooth if I'm not there to help people, as well as the kind of customer or user feedback side of things, I think we're going to build into our invite process that's driven by users. Yeah,
that's smart. Yeah, I've had a bunch of LPs have asked for invites over the months, and there was a link at one point, but I think what I've been saying now is just DM Dan, right?
Yeah, and if anyone's listening, if you send a DM to me on Twitter, I'm DWR, 3 letters, and just put the word Indiana in there. I get a lot of spam inbound, so by using those keywords, it just bubbles it up to the top, and then I can make sure you get an invite right after this.
Sweet. One thing I'm curious about, how does the feed work? To me, the feed is one of the most important, if not the most important, kind of issues around social networks right now. And especially with Twitter, I mean, Twitter seems to have gone back to this kind of algorithmic feed that it's really hard to use. Chronological is not default. And it's even confusing for me. Like, I think being transparent about the feed and the way the feed works is like an important way for a new social network to differentiate and just to provide a better service to users. Right now, though, I have the same question about the Farcaster feed. Like, it's not clear to me how it works. So maybe how does it work? Do you think it's important to be transparent about that, or do you plan to be more so? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So fortunate thing for me is I'm a 15+ year Twitter power user. So I have strong opinions on the Twitter product. So when I got to build my own feed, one, I think I have generally a pretty high quality bar. So wanted something that I would be happy with. And generally, I think people have been overall pretty happy. The default is start with reverse chronological. Here's the challenge with that. So one, for a power user, that's great. You have full control. You kind of understand the deterministic. I post like, and I'm following you. It's going to be at the top of the feed. There's no mucking around with things. The reveal preference, though, is consumers like algorithmic feeds if they're good. And obviously, TikTok is a great example of this, where you don't even have a follow model for the most part for most users, and it's just an endless stream of ups and downs based on your revealed preference on how long you watch those videos. So I think where we have been really kind of focused initially is keep the initial feed, because the types of people who are signing up right now are power users. So they're going to bias towards wanting, if I follow a user, that's what I want to see the content. I don't want to see other content. The two things that we will obviously, one, we have a concept of like a retweet, so a recast. So if someone I'm following recast, that's one way you get content outside of who you're directly following. And the second thing that we've been a little bit more aggressive compared to something like Twitter is we're really focused on conversations. And my view is Twitter is at its worst when people are using Twitter as a broadcast platform and really don't care about any of the engagement. They're just strictly trying to drive eyeballs to whatever podcast, video, website. They're not actually using Twitter as a conversational platform. They're strictly using it as a one-way broadcast platform. And so what we wanted to optimize for is the conversations that are actually having other people responding. And so the simplest thing is anytime someone replies to a conversation on Farcaster in the core feed, and assuming you're following those people, that gets bumped up to the top. So inevitably, if there's an active conversation, that kind of unit of kind of cast tweets effectively will sit at the top of your feed all day. And so it's just kind of that's the way the algorithm works. And what's great is actually the number of average replies to a cast compared to like even a sampling of tweets for myself is way higher. And also that has actually informed our recommendation algorithms, where this is the first time we're using machine learning, who to follow. And then we actually have this feed called highlights, which is more like a TikTok, where we're just trying to surface the best content. But we've been explicit in making it focused on the most active conversations versus something that, I don't know, is like a joke that gets a ton of likes, but no one is actually really going back and forth on that. Mm-hmm. Here's the important thing, though. Because Farcaster is an actual protocol and we'll have permissionless access to the underlying data and APIs, you are going to have dozens of clients and dozens of different algorithms and approaches that can suit different consumer preferences. And I think that's actually one of the motivating things for me to be working on this is I don't claim to have the perfect algorithm. And I think that, consumer preferences are very varied and diverse. And yes, there may be a couple of dominant ones, but that's okay to have like a long tail of kind of more niche products. And I think just imagine, for example, if email was a centrally administered spam algorithm. You know how like quickly that would get captured by whatever group of people, and then they would decide, oh, well, this is not spam, but this content shouldn't make it to the like front of email algorithms. We don't have that. We have a market-based solution where Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, and a whole long tail are out there. And so actually what you get is you get much better behavior. It's really, really honed in on what does a consumer actually want versus, oh, we have this kind of like monopoly on the content moderation. How can we actually go use this for what other ends? And so for me, the imperative here is actually not build the best algorithm, although we want to have as good of an algorithm as we can in our client. It's actually more about get to a place where there are dozens of other clients with other algorithms that can suit different consumer preferences. Mm-hmm.
Have you, is there a way to see like exactly the way the algorithm works, either in the app, or have you written about this or anything yet?
No, it's a good push. I think the following algorithm is extremely simple. There's no machine learning. It's just like the only time you'll see things that people that you're not following in reverse chronological order are recasts. Yeah. The highlights feed, that is a kind of like proto ML headed in the direction of kind of more of like a TikTok type thing.
Can you set the default to highlight right now or no?
No, that's the other thing is I can't stand that Twitter I've been using Twitter for 15 plus years, and every time I get to the app, I don't want to see the algo. I want to see the following first.
Right.
I'll tap the algo if I'm bored.
Yeah. Got it. Okay.
But here, like to be intellectually honest, though, consumers, like the average consumer, prefers an algo. They do not prefer reverse chronological. That is a power user feature. But a network like Twitter is interesting in that the power users are the ones that create the actual liquidity and the content. So you have to provide power users, I think, with the best possible experience. And on the margin, they're going to create more compelling content, which is actually going to pull in the people who want the algo feed.
Yeah.
And I think this is what Twitter has always not kind of like grokked, right? Like if I'm above a certain number of followers on Twitter and I'm posting on a regular basis, I should never see an ad in my feed. Like there are not that many people on Twitter like that. Like all they should be doing is trying to focus on, it's like, how can I get this person to post more? Because this is actually going to bring in the 200, whatever their fake metric they've had this like monetizable DAU number, which anytime you see a social network that doesn't use DAO, just like Facebook, it's cope. It's basically, we aren't Facebook. We don't want to be compared to Facebook. We don't actually have a compelling enough product to drive DAO. And so they come up with all these other metrics. Talk to anyone who's like, the Facebook has the two best metrics from a social network standpoint, DAO and time spent. And I think there was a question in the chat that says, how do you measure revealed preference? Daily active users. Like that's the only number you should be looking at, because to be a daily active user, that's a vote of utility every single day, right? Like to keep coming back. Probably means that the app is on their home screen. Monthly active user, I can send you an email that kind of like tricks you into clicking on the app, and all I have to do with that is once a month. Like it is a completely different mindset to build an app that someone would want to use every day, let alone multiple times a day. And I think that is something that we're really focused on, because that is the ultimate vote of, are we building something useful, as people are willing to use it every single day. Do
you think about the question of whether you said that what users want is the algorithmic feed, that just drives engagement. But do you consider that what users want might actually be bad for them? And is that something that you think about in building the product, particularly as a protocol kind of first that might have a different business model than advertisement, right? Because in the case of Twitter, and maybe they're trying to get away from this now, but like what users want might be bad for them, but it also aligns with the business model. So I think there's different considerations. I'm curious how you balance that. And maybe you disagree with my premise that what users want might be bad for them, but
yeah, I'm generally on the point of view is that the market actually is, going back to the stated versus revealed preference. If you have a true market and it's kind of like the barrier to entry is low, which today in social networks, you get these massive network effects, and then they can actually be rent extracting. Monopoly is not the right word, but within their social graph, they effectively are. I like television is a great example of this. So when television didn't have kind of like barriers, the barriers to entry was extremely high, right? Like Spectrum, and like you only had a few networks. There's a very limited, like what was allowed to be on TV in terms of content. The format was pretty standard. It's like, okay, advertising based, like you couldn't opt in. HBO comes along with the beginning of cable. And then as over time, as you kind of like lower the barrier to entry, and then especially with the internet where effectively, streaming, like you could just kind of come over the top, like the reveal preferences, consumers actually are willing to pay some amount of money for, baseline better content, right? Like network television is effectively toast relative to Netflix or HBO or Disney Plus. And so I think that is what I want to get to for social media is, can we actually get to a market where there's a sufficient network effect happening at a protocol level that you actually get to see a competing set of approaches, right? You have the paid clients, the subscription, the HBO equivalent. You have the ad free with ads, which I think a lot of people will still pick those types of clients. You'll have the algorithmic clients that are like totally engaging in terms of just trying to suck you in for multiple hours at a time, versus like one of the approaches that we have for our client is, if I get people to pay as a subscriber, I shift them from a user to a customer. And then I actually care much more about something like NPS. So like customer satisfaction of, versus time spent, right? If you're an advertising-based platform, the only number that matters for you if you want to make more money is increasing time spent, which then shows you more ads, right? Whereas in an environment where I all of a sudden have paying subscribers, maybe what my paying subscribers are saying to me is, I want a better signal to noise ratio. Show me less content in my feed, but using algorithms, show me the most relevant for me. And then at a certain point say, hey, everything else after this is going to be doom scrolling. I think for a busy person who's trying to make informed decisions about the world, they would be willing to pay a lot for that, right? And so I think that the key is getting to a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of clients and approaches, and then going back to the stated versus revealed preference, we're going to see what actually most consumers want, or different populations of consumers. Makes sense.
What are some of the most interesting? I mean, you don't want to highlight maybe one or the other, but are there any, from a user perspective, products kind of built on Farcaster that you really like? I mean, for me, Searchcaster, the one, like I'm guessing you are as well as a Twitter power user, but I use search quite a bit. And the one thing that Farcaster lacks in the client right now, I think, is search. And so Searchcaster, if anyone wants to check it out, I dropped it in the chat, but is kind of one of my favorite products that's kind of built on the open data layer, but maybe talk about a few that you think are particularly interesting.
Yeah, so Searchcaster was great in the sense that it was permissionlessly built. Had no idea. Greg Skriloff, just recent college graduate, just built it because he was excited about searching what was on Farcaster. And from our internal prioritization, we were saying, well, there's not enough content on Farcaster right now to justify us going and spending time on search versus some other feature. But the beauty of a protocol is if you're not solving what the market wants or someone's preference, they can go build it. And so I think Searchcaster is just like a great encapsulation of you actually increase the aggregate amount of output or innovation that's happening in an ecosystem when it is permissionless and open. So we actually haven't felt the compelling need to go build search now because Searchcaster exists, right? And you can imagine as Farcaster grows as a protocol, being the search engine for the protocol could end up being something that's pretty valuable. I'd fully expect, by the way, that there are going to be a bunch of other competitors to Searchcaster. So I think that's the kind of the flip side of the coin here is that that you actually have to constantly be building the best consumer experience or kind of like product experience because the barrier entry is so low, which I think is exciting because at the end of the day, then you get the best consumer experience possible because everyone's competing for that attention. I think where I'm most excited right now is we have a bunch of other clients being built. And so maybe that term kind of can get confusing. The simplest example here is just think of like web browsers. That's a client for the web. The original one, Netscape, then in Microsoft, then you have Firefox and Chrome and Safari. And so I think where we are today is we're kind of like the Netscape equivalent. And what we're hoping is that there's actually a bunch of other people who can provide that same core gateway service to the protocol. And, for the first 2 years, no one was interested in it. And I think last year we had our first kind of fully featured, going to show you a feed and another client, Discov, again, permissionlessly built by a developer in Berlin. And then as of the start of this year, we have, I'm aware of at least 6 teams that are working on clients that could fully replace, you would never have to use our main client. And so this is kind of, again, going back to that idea of if we had judged the success of the protocol after the first year, we basically had no developer interest, might as well just shut it down. But I think for us, it's always been about consistent growth of the total daily active users of the protocol is going to be the thing that actually attracts developers. And the analogy I always like to use is the iPhone. So when the original iPhone came out, they sold somewhere between 5 and 10 million of them. There was no third-party app store. The only first-party apps were built by Apple. Apple even built the YouTube and Google Maps apps. And so it's easy to forget that for that first year, they were the one just selling the device based on the existing feature set. And once they got to that kind of initial community and if you're carrying around a phone, you're a daily active user of the phone. That's the second year when they launched the App Store. And then even then, those first couple of years, if you actually just look, you type TechCrunch, top apps in the App Store 2009, most of those apps don't exist today. And it took a few years for people to natively understand, oh, this is the capability of this device, that people are carrying around all the time. You get the WhatsApps, you get the Instagrams, you start to get the actual like mobile native companies that have grown up while this is a platform. And I think that's the same thing that's happening with Farcaster, where the initial set of ideas are kind of like tinker projects. And then I think that they start to get more sophisticated as you've grown the total number of people on the protocol, because that's actually what developers care about. They don't care about the underlying technology of a protocol for the most part. They care about is liquidity. And in the case of DeFi, that's total value locked or whatever. And in the case of social, it's daily active users, right? Like the liquidity that generates both the posts, but the eyeballs, right?
Mm-hmm. How do you incentivize developers? Because I guess like the App Store example, developers came because there were users, but also because there was a way to make money. I guess first just, in the App Store charging for your app, but also, advertising became kind of a business model. So what do you, it's awesome that there's, 6 clients in the works right now. How are these developers thinking about incentives? And do you think kind of incentive alignment between yourself, as Merkle, the company, and the developers is important? Maybe share more on how you think about that.
Yeah, so I'm back to the markets thing. I think if you just strip away all, incentives, hackathons, all this other kind of stuff, the thing that developers care about is I want to build something and I want people to use it. And so driving the total number of addressable daily active users and making sure the technology works, right? Like right now, like we have a bunch of stuff that we still need to kind of go figure out. But here's a simple example. With Farcaster, where we should be in the next 6 months is you see an app in your feed that is kind of Farcaster enabled. You can tap that. It's going to take you to that app. And then you can kind of swipe once to just kind of sign in with Farcaster. And then that app magically has access to your kind of credentials in the background. And then you can go use that. Getting to that level of just kind of distribution for kind of like a crypto or Web3 app, where you're not having to muck around with MetaMask or any of these other things. And it just kind of feels much more like installing an app from the App Store. I think that is a 10x improvement for developers to be able to get the distribution and people to actually go use their app. And the thing I would push on is, yeah, the App Store let you charge money, but Apple actually charges for that. And in theory, you could do it outside the App Store. The reveal preference is consumers really enjoy this like really seamless experience to get an app. And so I actually think convenience, and this is something that we learned at Coinbase, that's a reveal preference for consumers. Yes, you can go store your Bitcoin or ETH or whatever you have with a user-controlled wallet, but the reveal preference is that most people like to keep it safe on Coinbase because it has password reset and all these other kind of things. And so I think where we're really focused on is if we can make this most seamless way to onboard into kind of like Web3 or crypto, and in most cases, the user doesn't even necessarily even need to know about it. But then the kind of, I always use the mullet example. It's like kind of feels Web2 in the front, business in the front, and then like party Web3 in the back. But like that's the actual architecture of Farcaster. And so you get to a place where we make it really, really easy to onboard. We're growing the total number of daily active users in this ecosystem. And I can actually show like, hey, people are using this app every single day. Like we're focused on DAOs, not MAOs. Developers are going to show up. Like they're desperate for growth. They're desperate for that set of first 1,000 or 10,000 users. And so I think that is the single biggest thing that we can do to drive developer adoption versus anything on the margin. I think if we get to some level of scale, we will have the ability to kind of figure out, because there is going to be a fee associated with a Farcaster account, but you can kind of think of it as like Twitter Blue, but you're paying a smart contract on Ethereum. And from that, I think we can, if we can prove that we can get a scaled number of users to pay for a premium account to a protocol, then I actually think you can think about how do you divvy that up. Maybe some developers are actually contributing more to the usage of that. So maybe they get rewarded for that, but that's so far in the future. And I think that the primary focus is just continue to drive the total number of daily active users in the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So do you think, I think there's not, you could argue it's not at scale, but there's a number of people using Farcaster right now that would pay right now. Do you think that would be something that you kind of add even before you open it up to more people and maybe ungate it? Or how are you, and maybe are there metrics that you're tracking before you want to ungate it? Maybe talk a little bit about just how you're thinking about roadmap.
Yeah, so we have 3 big milestones to get the protocol to what I would say is kind of like a credibly neutral, permissionless, something that I would actually, from an intellectual honesty standpoint, say this is a permissionless as Ethereum. So the first is we have to get this kind of special server out, a node for the Farcaster network called the Hub. So that's in May. And what's nice about that is after that's done, a developer can just go to GitHub, pull down this Farcaster Hub code, run it in their own infrastructure, and they will have full access to the global state of the network. So there is no privileged, like, oh, Merkle, because they created it, they have all this additional data. It's just you get the exact same state, and that's how Ethereum works. And I think that that's a critical component to being able to look a developer in the eye and say, hey, go build a business, spend the next few years trying to build something on top of this protocol. Because if you don't hit that level, you get to what happened with Twitter, which Twitter, the early days of Twitter, you had this robust third-party ecosystem of developers, strategy changed in 2014, that got kind of handicapped, and then Elon shows up and then just overnight says, hey, sorry, the remaining Twitter API, that's getting deprecated in 2 weeks. So I think developers at this point are sophisticated enough to think about platform risk. And so getting to a place of that credible neutrality, the unruggable protocol from a social standpoint, that's really critical. Second thing is we need to get to Ethereum mainnet and prove that people are willing to pay for that premium account to the protocol. That's a hypothesis right now. I think to your point, there's a dedicated group of early users that are kind of indicating interest, but getting someone to part with their hard-earned cash, like that's a revealed preference, and we need to get to that point. And then the third part is getting out of this gated state, right? Like how do you go from kind of Facebook gated.edu to anyone in the world can go sign up? And I think that comes down to, I'm just like relentlessly focused on just your standard retention metrics, right? So because it's gated right now, actually signups, like that's fine. Like most people we send a sign up to are going to make it through the sign up. But the, day 1 retention, day 7 retention, day 30 retention of just like what percentage of users if they sign up, like come back, 30 days later, I want that to be basically top 10%. With any Web2 social network. And if we hit that point, which I feel pretty confident that we're going to be able to get there this year, like we're already top 25%, but if we can get to top 10%, then you know that you have a machine that for every user you add into the machine, you're going to retain, X%, like that becomes something that you can actually compound. And then I think you can shift more towards a growth mentality. The last thing that I think is interesting is I don't think we're ever going to grow as fast as the traditional Web2 social networks because of this single on-chain fee, right? Like the rest of Farcaster is off-chain. The architecture, I think, is really, really designed to make it usable. But that on-chain fee, some people would say, oh, that's never going to get you to 1 billion users. And the counter to that, I would say, is actually that might be fine for the foreseeable future, because what you end up getting is you get built-in spam prevention. Right? If it costs $1 or $5 to just even sign up that initial account, and we can have a slick Apple Pay integration, and you might even need to see the crypto, right? It can just happen behind the scenes. But then you don't run into any of these problems that Twitter has dealt with. And so what you can actually confidently say is if you have 10,000 followers on Farcaster, you have a much higher confidence that those are 10,000 real people. Like you could actually put them in a stadium and be there, versus 10,000 followers on Twitter, like could end up being like 3,000 people and a bunch of bots. So I think shifting the narrative also around the quality of your audience. And the other thing we can do is we can measure the on-chain activity of those people. So now all of a sudden, and this is a biology concept, is you can actually start to measure the economy size, the on-chain economy size of your audience, right? Like biology always used to bring this up, where he would say, imagine if Kim Kardashian could actually say the 200 million people who follow her on Instagram, like this is how much economic activity they generate. Mm-hmm. Well, with a network like Farcaster, and if you believe more stuff was going to end up on chain, you can quantitatively, in a permissionless way, like know exactly how much economic activity are the 10,000 people who are following me on Farcaster. And so I think that once we've figured that out, I think then we're in more of a growth mode, because we're actually selling a different product than just something that looks like Twitter but is decentralized.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. There's a few other questions I wanted to ask. I'm just curious about personally, but one is identity, right? How do you think about kind of the Farcaster identity layer? You kind of, it seems you, rather than kind of use ENS or bootstrap some existing identity layer, you kind of have created your own identity layer, and presumably, you know, the identity that I create on the main Farcaster client will persist across you know, other clients. How do you think about that? Why, I guess why choose to create your own rather than bootstrap another, and maybe how you see identity in the Farcaster kind of ecosystem evolving?
Yeah, so if you look at identity, it's trended in kind of one direction towards like kind of being simpler. So the internet starts, email is kind of like the first killer app. So that becomes the de facto identity that developers on the web use. And then mobile shows up and actually stuff shifts to phone numbers. And then if you actually just look at the at scale public social networks, they don't use a phone number. They don't use email as your identifier. They use a username. And so like that's just been a consistent trend. And this is actually one of the reasons I think that the federated model of like kind of like weird username spaces it's not modern. Like people want to be at blank, like that's just the consumer preference. And so you need to kind of hit that UX. And that doesn't sound hard, but when you're trying to do it in a decentralized system, that actually gets tricky because you need to have a canonical representation of at Nick or at DWR. And so that's actually a lot of the design of Farcaster is like, how can you make this done in a decentralized way with like reasonable ownership guarantees over that while still being really usable? I think that the second thing, if you take something like ENS, how many daily active users does ENS have? Not people who have a wallet with an ENS in it, like an actual application that ENS is like core to the user experience. And when we started working on it in 2020, like, and even today, it's extremely low. Like no one is actually mentioning ENS. They have it, they might put it in their Twitter bio, but the reality is like, you're not actually a daily active user of an app where that is a core foundational component. And so I think that means you don't have to be beholden to any one identity system because there isn't actually an identity system, and you should be building the best user experience. Mm-hmm. And so in our case, when we were starting, it's just saying, okay, let's actually go build the user experience that we want. So example with ENS, unlimited number of characters. Okay, so I have a 32 character ENS name. Now, does that get shown in the UI and it looks so clunky? Do I truncate it? So when you start to actually think through the product details of this, you realize that like, hey, Twitter and Instagram, where they limit things to 16 characters, Latin only alphabet, like from a product experience standpoint, you quickly get to a solution and then you realize like, hey, we're going to bootstrap our own because it's actually in service of our own product. And if you're focused on building a product that people are willing to use every day, you're going to make a different set of trade-offs than some kind of open standard that you're hoping other people go and use. And so that's how we approach it.
Makes sense. Yeah, agreed on. I mean, the main, in terms of active users of ENS, it's people trading ENS, right? And we actually just invested in ENS Vision, which is a marketplace for ENS. So I think there is activity and there is a base of daily active users, but maybe not the daily active users that you're interested in.
Let me be super clear. I actually am bullish on ENS. I think ENS is great. I think of it much more akin to the domain name system, but how many people today have their own domain name relative to the domain market is huge and domains sell for a lot, right? They're effectively like NFTs, but it's a very different, it's a prosumer or professional market versus the average user just wants something that's super simple. Yep.
Will Farcaster usernames be NFTs at some point and tradable? That's obviously something
that's actually one of the primary reasons other than the decentralization and the kind of security that you get from the Ethereum L1, I think the composability of Farcaster usernames within the existing ecosystem. So when you register a Farcaster username, you know, think about it today on Twitter. If you had a great username and you wanted to sell it, like, A, it's against Twitter's terms of service. I think Elon actually might be doing some type of auction system, but 15 years later, they have never done that.
Yeah.
When Farcaster launches on mainnet later this year, day one, you could just go list it on OpenSea. Like, we don't have to build any of that economic infrastructure. Any innovation that happens for an NFT on Ethereum we get out of the box. And so I think that's the other thing that I think Web 2 people, when they look at Farcaster and they've seen we've made a bunch of pragmatic approaches, then they always go, well, you don't even need the blockchain. You could just go do this. And then they actually haven't thought deeply about like, hey, there's actually a bunch of things that the blockchain solves from a product standpoint.
Yeah.
So it's useful in of its own right. But then they just don't get composability and they think that's irrelevant, when the reality is that's actually a whole nother layer of permissionless innovation that I'm just super excited to see where people take it.
Right. I might have to hit you up for a few more Farcaster usernames then.
Well, that's one of the other reasons we don't want to open it up, right? Because if you open it up right now, you're just going to have a bunch of people squat.
Yeah.
And that's basically selling future value from the protocol to a bunch of people who kind of get in early and like, we're again not in a short term, like, can we boost some price of something? It's like we're building something for the long term.
Yeah, I do think there is some economic benefit of that as well, and just getting people you know, that have aligned incentives with you for the thing to work. But certainly there's an extreme way that could go that's negative. So
yeah, I would say, like, I do think that the way to do it is you have a gated period at the beginning, and at some point you have to pull the Band-Aid off and then go to the free market and let squatting happen. That will happen. But I want to make sure there's like a long enough period where anyone who's reasonably interested in this stuff can go and get their username and didn't have to pay some rent extractor. Like I just, you know.
Awesome. All right, Dan. Well, thanks a lot for joining us. Really enjoyed the chat. I appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, I'll see you soon.
Cool. And like I said, anyone who wants a Farcaster invite, just DM me on Twitter, DWR, and use the word Indiana, and I'll send it to you today.
Awesome.